Hello and welcome to Our Stories and Ourselves, a podcast about how our minds make stories and stories make us. My name is Kirsty, and in this show, I talk about the stories we tell ourselves about the world, the stories we tell ourselves about other people, and about how the way we think shapes these stories and shapes us. This is episode 13, and is about stranger danger and other fear-inducing stories we've been told. I'll be talking about how these stories feed into the way we go about our lives and the wider social context we live in. I'm going to be talking a fair bit about violence, abuse, and murder in this one. I won't be going into any details, but if that's not something you feel like listening to right now, please do sit this one out. Stranger danger. It's a simple rhyming phrase that I still remember learning about in childhood. Don't talk to strangers was the message we heard again and again. Any stranger could be, or even is, a danger and should be avoided. I recall one story in particular. I think it was in a picture book. A child was walking home from his first day at school. A man pulled up beside him in a car and said that the child's mum had sent him to pick the child up. He even knew the child's name. I can't remember what it was, but let's call him Kevin. Kevin was reluctant to get in the car at first, but was eventually convinced that this man did indeed know his mum, and was about to climb into the car when someone else, who actually knew Kevin, appeared and stopped him. She pointed out that Kevin was still wearing a name tag, so the strange man could work out his name. The man quickly drove off, and Kevin made it home safely. But the message ingrained itself into my mind. Don't trust strangers. However, in reality, stranger danger is not the biggest risk to children. Of children who do, sadly or infuriatingly, experience sexual abuse, only about 7% are abused by a stranger. The other 93% know their abuser. But growing up, it was stranger danger that we were warned of. Because the stranger danger message is so far from reality, the US Center for Missing and Exploited Children have even advocated for moving away from this messaging. It's not helpful, and it doesn't encourage good safety behaviours in children. They actually struggle to understand what we mean by a stranger. However, once a message like this gets out there, it can be difficult to rein in, especially when it has such a snappy catchphrase. So the message has hung on. Not only that, but it's definitely something parents fear. According to journalist and podcaster Michael Hobbs' blog, in the 1980s, people thought children had a 50-50 chance of being abducted. That's absolutely wild. There's a 50-50 chance that a coin toss will come up heads. 1 in 2 every time it is tossed. Now, I couldn't find where Hobbs found this fact, but he's generally pretty reliable, so I'll go with it. And this, of course, could be at least partly due to the fact that people are bad at understanding odds. And I don't know how the question was phrased, but it is stark that the perception is just so out of touch with reality. The stat he quotes doesn't specify a time frame, but even if it's at any point during childhood, that would mean that half of all children would be abducted at some point before they reach 18. And that is definitely not what is happening, or for that matter, what was happening in the 80s. So while some of this may come down to people being bad at understanding what 50-50 chance actually means, It also tells me that people are far more scared of their children being abducted by a stranger than is warranted by the reality. According to Pew Research from 2023, their child being kidnapped is third highest on the list of parental worries. It's behind only mental health difficulties and bullying, which are definitely frustratingly common, and before assaults, drug and alcohol problems, and shootings. So let's take a look at what the reality is. According to a US Department of Justice publication, in 2011 there were 105 what they called stereotypical stranger child abductions in the US. It was a similar number to those in 1997, and the number has held pretty steady over time. It's still 105 too many, of course, but that is definitely not a 50-50 chance. I actually worked it out with the US Census data, and it's a tiny fraction of a percent, about 0.00017 of a percent, if you really wanted to know. I've got to be honest, I struggle to even wrap my head around a number that small. So why are we so scared of this story of abductions by strangers? I think there are several reasons, and all of them tell us something about our society and the stories we tell ourselves about the world. Part of it is that fear sells newspapers. Or, more generally, scary stories get eyes on screens and engaging with the media. Things that stir up fear get a lot of attention in the press. Another part of it is that rare events make headlines. People are much more likely to die in a car crash than a plane crash. But plane crashes get a lot more attention. This is one of the reasons more people are scared of flying than of being in a car. Similarly, on the rare occasion when a young child is abducted, the story gets a lot of attention, and rightly so. On the rare occasions when it does happen, the more people looking out the better. In fact, the Amber Alert system has resulted in 1,268 abducted children being recovered from its beginning in 1996 to the end of December 2024. For anyone not familiar with Amber Alerts, it's a system where the media work with police to put out alerts about missing children. Since its inception, it has been very successful and has been widely replicated across the world. For example, in the report for 2024, there were 189 Amber Alerts, and 188 resulted in recovery of the child, with one child still missing at the end of the year. These included family abductions as well as acquaintances and strangers. Sadly, 9 of those children were found deceased. That's again 9 children too many, but it's also a tiny fraction of the US population. So, in the circumstances of child abduction, media attention has huge benefits, and I'm definitely not saying it shouldn't be there. It absolutely should be. However, media attention does not mean frequency. People often conflate the two, and this is another reason why the stranger danger narrative sticks. While I'm talking about media, occasionally a very incorrect number pops up online that somewhere around 400,000 children go missing in the US each year, and the media doesn't report on it. This is just plain wrong. The number comes from the number of missing children reports across the year, but it doesn't account for how many of those children are found or show up, or for duplicate reports. So if a kid, let's call her Kelly, goes to her friend's house and doesn't call her parents to say where she is, that might get reported by Kelly's mum, who also calls Kelly's dad to find out if he's seen Kelly. He hasn't, so he calls and reports her missing too. When Kelly heads home a few hours later, any cases and alerts are closed, but the numbers stay in the system. Kelly is grounded, but the next week she sneaks out to see her friends, and her parents report her missing again. That's 3 reports for a single child who hasn't been abducted at all. This is a pretty common pattern. Once you know that, you can start to see why there is a massive difference between the numbers of missing persons reports and the number of Amber Alerts. So these numbers get shared around without the context behind them. And as much as I love statistics, that is the danger of them. You always need to know where the number comes from, how it was gathered, and what the caveats are. I think another part of the sticking power of the stranger danger narrative is fear of things we can't control. Parents can control, more or less, who their child encounters in their home. They may be deceived by someone they trust, but they at least have a sense of control. Therefore, they think that while on average children are more likely to be harmed by someone they know, in their specific instance, their child is not at risk. We all want to believe our friends and family are good people, and most of the time they are. So it makes sense to emphasize the danger from strangers. My family are safe. My friends are safe. So it's only the strangers I have to worry about. We talked a lot about a sense of control over the world in our recent Life Isn't Fair episode, which I think also plays into this. People want to believe that they have control over their child's safety, understandably, and they do have a lot, but sometimes life isn't fair, and bad things do happen to good people. Interestingly, the rates of offences against children perpetrated by family goes down as they get older, but offences by acquaintances goes up. Offences by complete strangers stay pretty low, but it does increase slightly with the child's age. Now, I didn't do a deep dive into all of the reasons for this, and I'm sure there's a complicated relationship between access, expectations a child might speak up, and other things here. But it's interesting when you think about who is at risk from who. Another part of this dynamic, I think, is that behind the stranger danger narrative is the implication bad things will only happen to children when parents aren't there. So again, it makes sense for parents to advocate caution. They assume they will protect their child when they are present, and so only strangers are a risk. And no parent wants to think they may get it wrong. Another way that the reality of child abductions varies from the narrative we have is that it's often part of a custody dispute. According to the Amber Alert report I mentioned earlier, family abductions are the most frequent. It's most likely to be the child's mother, followed by their father, and it's usually not someone who intends to harm the child. And yet, the narrative of stranger danger sticks. And you may wonder, what's the harm? Sure, most strangers aren't dangerous. There are some who are, so why risk it? But teaching stranger danger to the exclusion of everything else can actually do more harm than good. One example I came across was children getting lost, but being scared to call out to strangers because they were strangers. Imagine it. You've wandered off from your family while camping, taken a wrong turn, and gotten lost in the woods. Now it's getting dark, you're alone and scared. You hear people calling out your name, but you don't know their voices. You remember what you were told about not talking to strangers, so you stay silent, curled up in a ball, shivering, hoping mum or dad will find you soon. Eventually, a rescuer spots you and crouches beside you. They say they're helping your parents to look for you, and they can take you to them. You've heard this story. They read it to you at school. You pull away. The rescuer tries to reassure you, but this just scares you more. You try to run, but you're tired, and they quickly grab you. They carry you away and you struggle. as they again try to reassure you that they're taking you to your parents. You're safe and you'll see them soon. Soon you hear your mum calling your name and your dad lifts you from the rescuer's arms. After they've calmed you, had a doctor check you over and assure you're all right, they take you over to the rescuer to say thank you. You shrink away, the residual fear from your experience still strong. Your parents are puzzled, not realizing why you were so scared. But it makes sense to you. Strangers are dangerous. You've been told again and again. This particular story is fiction, but it captures incidents included in the reporting about why the stranger danger message itself can be dangerous. I'm not saying we shouldn't teach children to be cautious. We absolutely should. However, it's more complex than stranger danger. Some strangers are safe, and sadly, some people we know are dangerous. This is a harder thing to teach, but it does keep children safer. To go back to the story about Kevin, or whatever his actual name was in the book, there are other things in that story which were warning signs. The stranger didn't want to take no for an answer. That's more of a red flag than the simple fact they were a stranger. Part of keeping kids safe is teaching them about boundaries and adults respecting children's boundaries. This includes not making kids hug Aunt Gertrude if they don't want to. She can cope. There are, of course, times when parents and caregivers do have to override what children want. Kids are bad at risk assessment and often do want to do things that are a bad idea. Or they don't want to do things like wear shoes and sun hats when they really do need to. However, there is a huge difference between making a child put on a jumper when they are almost blue and cold and shivering, despite them insisting they don't need it, and things like hugging relatives. And that difference is actually one of the key things that kids need to learn. We need to change some of our narratives about what is expected of and considered polite in children. This in turn will help them advocate for their boundaries and to tell their caregivers if they do encounter a risky situation. I read a great blog about this, written by a therapist, who describes it as teaching children about tricky people and about behaviours and situations that might be unsafe. For example, keeping a secret from their parents or going somewhere without permission. Even then, there's a difference between keeping a secret about, say, a birthday present for a few days and a dangerous secret. Kids can learn that difference, and it gives them a great tool when they do. Nuance again. I do keep coming back to that. This is harder than a simple message of being aware of strangers, or scared of strangers. It's an ongoing conversation about secrets, trust, boundaries, safety, and consent. It's about learning the right words for body parts and appropriate boundaries with them. When things might be appropriate from a medical professional, but not from a schoolmate. It's hard, especially for parents who didn't grow up having these sorts of conversations and who learn to associate their bodies with shame. It's also a deviation about societal narratives about children doing what they are told. It's tough to challenge the narratives we were brought up with and work out a way to keep kids safe without being scared of the world. One of the many articles I read for this recommended Berenstain Bears Learn About Strangers as a good starting point for young kids. Another article mentioned that a large part of it is about a more broad, open, communicative relationship with your child. All the resources are on the show website if you want to explore further. However, just because I'm saying that strangers are rarely a danger to children, I'm not saying we should just let kids run free wherever they want. There are lots of good reasons not to let kids out on their own. Like I just said, they're bad at risk assessment. Traffic is the first problem that springs to mind and aligns with the statistics on risks to children, especially with the number of trucks, SUVs, four-wheel drives, or whatever they're called where you are, on the road these days. It makes much more sense not to allow a child to cycle somewhere because of the risk of them being hit by a car than the risk of them being abducted by a stranger. On a slight tangent, there's another narrative about strangers that I wanted to talk about. This is a story that, even when not dangerous, strangers tend to be uncaring, especially if there are a lot of them around. This is called the bystander effect. I almost covered this in the Stories from Psych 101 episode, but the incident that triggered the research wasn't an experiment, and the research itself is actually pretty good. There's a lot of myth-making around this story. So, the bystander effect was theorized after a woman named Kitty Genovese was murdered in New York. Reports at the time, and for years afterwards, said that there were 38 witnesses who heard her screams for help and did nothing. That isn't actually what happened. However, it became the dominant narrative and led to a whole field of study of the behaviour of strangers when people need help. More on that in a bit, but first to the reality of the story. There were very few people, definitely not 38, who heard Kitty Genovese call for help. And most of those who did hear something weren't sure what it was. That's quite different from 38 people witnessing a murder and doing nothing. One person who heard her did try to intervene. He shouted at the attacker, who then briefly ran away. Unfortunately, the bystander didn't know how badly Kitty was injured, and the attacker returned wearing a hat to be harder to recognise. He found her again and continued the attack inside the apartment building lobby, where it was much harder for anyone to see what was happening. Even then, one of Kitty's neighbours found her, called an ambulance, and held her as she sadly died. It's a very sad story, but as far as the bystanders are concerned, it's not as bad as the news reports at the time made it sound. The story in the New York Times was it was a cold, uncaring neighbourhood of strangers who didn't look out for each other. That's another element to the narrative. I'm mostly familiar with the story from Psych 101 class, talking about the bystander effect, but it has come up in pop culture again and again, and is often talked about in the context of the collapse of community and the uncaringness of cities, or rather of people in cities. Kitty Genovese lived in an apartment in Queens, which was overlooked by many others. Part of the willingness to believe that there were that many witnesses who did nothing is because of the story of the cold, big city full of strangers that many people believe. In other words, as with other misinformation stories that I've covered, it fits with a narrative already in people's head, so it wasn't interrogated too deeply. The field of research that this story inspired did find that people tend to experience diffusion of responsibility, bigger groups. In other words, the more people who are around, the less likely any one person will assist because they assume someone else will deal with it. But that doesn't mean no one ever helps. Not only that, but as soon as one person helps, others usually will too, because of social pressure. So there's a few things from the research that can be useful takeaways. If you ever need help, and you're surrounded by people, try and make eye contact with someone. Focusing on one person builds a connection and removes the diffusion. And if you're a bystander and need help to help, pick out specific people for tasks. As well as the diffusion of responsibility, a lot of people get kind of frozen by fear or not knowing what to do. Once they know how to help, most people are happy to do so. But to bring us back to the main topic of this episode, I do think that this wider narrative about lack of community and people not knowing their neighbours is part of why the stranger danger message sticks too. If only we knew all of our neighbours, then there wouldn't be strangers, and then no danger. If only that were true. We know the number of trusted community figures like priests, pastors, coaches, and Boy Scout leaders who have used their position to hide abuse. Even other authority figures. UK listeners, and possibly some from elsewhere, may be familiar with the Rotherham sexual abuse and grooming scandal that occurred between 1997 and 2013. Recent reporting has revealed that several of the victims allege they were also raped by police when they first came forward with accusations. And potentially that police may even, allegedly, have been involved in the grooming gangs. The people that they were meant to go to for help failed them. So yeah, sometimes it's hard to know who to trust. The age of the girls hurt in that scandal also reminds me of another problem with the stranger danger myth. It generally focuses on young children who are actually less likely to be assaulted or abducted. The Department of Justice publication I mentioned earlier found that the majority of victims of stranger kidnappings were 12 to 17-year-old girls. We need to challenge our cultural narratives about who is at risk. I do think this is slowly changing, but there are still a lot of misapprehensions about. However, it has become more widely recognised in the wake of all of the coverage of Jeffrey Epstein and the way he and Ghislaine, how you say it, Maxwell, trafficked vulnerable teen girls for years without anyone seemingly caring. Take the heartbreaking case of Virginia Jeffrey. She was befriended by an adult she met while working, not a stranger. Unfortunately, that adult was Maxwell. Virginia Jeffrey wasn't dragged away off the street on her way home. She was groomed and lured in with the promise of a job. Then she was mistreated and sexually abused by the people she had trusted and or those given access to her by those people. She was particularly vulnerable, as she'd earlier been abused by a family friend and had run away from home before she encountered Maxwell. She wasn't a 6-year-old lost in a crowd or a kid walking home from school. Teenage girls with bad home lives are much more vulnerable to exploitation. But it's not a stranger grabbing them most of the time. It's someone who slowly builds trust. And it takes much more than mentioning stranger danger to guard against it. So that's depressing, but once we know those things, we can look at how we safeguard children of all ages and make sure that when teenage girls, teenagers, children of any age are vulnerable, that they have people who believe them, that are safe to turn to, and that they know that they can speak up. So I don't want to end up on too grim a note. While strangers can be dangerous, and people we know can be dangerous, and cops can be dangerous, there are also so many people out there who are wonderful and helpful and kind. As I mentioned with Kitty Genovese, there were people who tried to help her, people who took risks to be there for her. One of the reasons Amber Alerts work is because people listen to them, keep a lookout, and report any sightings. People rush to join search parties when kids are missing, and they line up to donate blood after disasters. Side note on that, if you're able to, go donate blood now and regularly. If not, that's cool, but if you can, it's not just after disasters when it's needed. Which reminds me, I need to look into donating plasma, but now I'm getting off track. Part of the bystander effect, as well as people thinking someone else will handle it, is thinking someone else may be better qualified or know more about what to do than I do, so they don't help once people know what to do, they generally do want to help. I live in a fairly big city, and regularly people will offer to help me if I'm carrying something heavy. And recently, when I was out with my mum and she fell, lots of people stopped to check on her. Some of this may come from us being small white women. Other people may get less help, but in general, people do help and people do care. Anyway, as you may have noticed, this episode was late. It was for a range of reasons, not the least of which is that I ended up with over 30 sources, which are now, of course, on the website, ourstoriesandourselves.com. That's more than most, if not all of my undergrad essays. I'm thinking about how to produce well-sourced but less intense episodes and do more interviews, but releases might be a bit sporadic for a while. However, I have got some good ones coming up, looking at the way Terry Pratchett talks about narrative and narratives about disability, among other things. In the meantime, why not hop into the chats on Patreon or at ourstories.bluesky.social or email me ourstoriesandourselves@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and to close with a quote, and a quote within a quote, from US TV personality Mr. Rogers. To quote, "When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping.' To this day, especially in times of disaster, I remember my mother's words, and I am always comforted by realizing that there are still so many helpers, so many caring people in this world." End quote. See you in a couple of weeks.